The rain had just started to fall when my phone buzzed against the passenger seat. I was halfway across the 520 bridge, the skyline of Seattle glowing faintly through a mist that turned the city into something ghostly, unreachable. It should have been a night to look forward to, dinner at my daughter's home, a family evening like we'd done for years. But the name that flashed across the screen froze the air in my lungs. Call me urgently. Michael's message was blunt, stripped of pleasantries. My lawyer of 20 years had never used that word, urgent, about family. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles whitening as the car hummed across the slick pavement. I pulled to the shoulder just before the bridge ended, rain hammering against the windshield like impatient fists. My fingers trembled as I dialed. His voice came through hard, professional, stripped of warmth. Wyatt, you need to brace yourself. Emily filed a petition this morning. She's asking the court to declare you incompetent to manage Hansen Systems. The words shattered inside me. For a moment I thought the call had broken, that I'd misheard. Incompetent. From my daughter. The daughter whose future I had built this company for. The girl who used to climb onto my shoulders to watch fireworks at Lake Union. The teenager I sent to Stanford with every dollar of overtime I'd scraped together. The rain blurred the windshield, a curtain of water I couldn't see through. My chest burned as though my heart had forgotten how to beat. That's impossible, I muttered, more to myself than to him. She's my daughter. Michael didn't soften. She's gathered shareholders, names you know. She's presenting documents, medical references, even witness statements. The hearing is set in 1 week. The steering wheel felt slick under my grip. 1 week. She had been preparing this while sitting across the table from me at Sunday dinners, smiling, pouring wine, asking about my blood pressure as if she cared. A daughter who once whispered bedtime stories with her mother's voice had spent months sharpening knives in the dark. I sat there, engine idling, rain pounding, my mind replaying every moment I might have looked tired in a meeting. Every time my voice rose with passion. Every hesitation I'd shown in front of a board too young to understand patience. She was using all of it, twisting love into evidence, grief into weakness. The thought of walking into her warm house tonight, smelling the roast chicken, hearing my granddaughter chatter about preschool, while knowing Emily had already signed papers to strip me of my life's work. It made the air in the car too thin to breathe. Yet a strange resolve began to harden in me. I needed to see her face. I needed to look into her eyes and find out who she had become. By the time I pulled into her driveway in Bellevue, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets shining like black glass. Her front door opened before I could knock. She stood there in a cream sweater, her smile practiced, precise, like a photograph in a magazine. Dad, right on time. She embraced me, but the hug was hollow, rehearsed. Inside, the house was filled with the smell of herbs and butter, but underneath it lingered something sharp, metallic. Her husband Trevor hovered near the dining table, voice too bright as he offered me wine. My granddaughter Sophie ran into my arms, her small crayon-stained fingers clutching a drawing of me at a desk with her beside me. The innocence of it made my throat ache. She knew nothing of the war her mother was already waging. Through dinner, Emily's voice flowed smooth, polite, each question about my health landing like a test she was scoring silently. She watched me with the same intensity she had in boardrooms, gauging, calculating, dissecting. I answered with forced calm, every smile costing me more than the last. The roast chicken, the laughter of a child, the soft clink of silverware. Ordinary details wrapped around a betrayal so extraordinary it hollowed the room. When I finally stepped out into the night again, the drizzle had turned the streetlights into blurred halos. I stood on her porch, my hands still on the brass handle, my chest echoing with the weight of her performance. She had hugged me, fed me, poured my wine, all while preparing to destroy me. I drove aimlessly through Seattle, headlights cutting through wet streets, the Space Needle blinking faintly in the distance like a lighthouse I no longer trusted. My phone buzzed again, Michael asking how dinner had gone. My voice cracked as I answered, like theater. She knows how to act concerned while carving me open. At home, the silence pressed down heavier than the rain. 30 years of photographs lined my study. Groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, smiling faces of employees who had become like family. In the middle, framed carefully, Emily at 12 years old, holding the first Hansen Systems prototype with pride glowing in her eyes. The little girl who once believed her father could build anything had grown into a woman who believed she could take everything. I opened my safe, pulling out the letters my late wife, Ellen, had written before she passed. Her handwriting still trembled with life. "She thinks you don't love her," one note said. "She needs you more than the company does." I had dismissed it then, telling myself time would prove my devotion. Now that dismissal had returned like a ghost, wearing my daughter's face, carrying a lawsuit like a weapon. As the clock pushed past midnight, I sat in the dark, the rain steady against the windows. My daughter had drawn the first line of battle. I could hear Ellen's voice, soft but firm, asking me to remember what family meant. But all I could feel was the sharp edge of betrayal, a cold determination rising in my chest. Emily believed she had outmaneuvered me. She believed she had prepared her case so perfectly that I would walk into court already defeated. But she had forgotten something essential. I was the one who had taught her how to fight, how to strategize, how to win when the odds were stacked against her. And as I stared out at the city I had helped shape, the company I had built with blood and time, I knew this. If she wanted a war, she would get one. But she had underestimated her enemy. She had underestimated her father. The morning after that phone call, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a cup of black coffee gone cold. The rain had lifted, leaving a pale gray sky over Seattle, but the silence inside my house was louder than any storm. 30 years of building Hansen Systems had given me a fortune, a skyline view, and a legacy that stretched across the city. Yet that morning all I could see were the empty spaces where my family should have been. Ellen's voice haunted the corners of the room, her laughter echoing faintly in my memory, her warnings scribbled in old letters I had locked away for years. She had always told me Emily needed more of me, not just the things I provided. I used to brush it off, telling myself success was the same as love, that the company was proof of devotion. Now, with my daughter preparing to tear it all from me, I wondered if Ellen had known this ending was inevitable. I pushed away the cup and stood, my knees stiff from age but my mind alive with restless energy. The house felt like a museum, every wall hung with framed milestones. Photos of ribbon cuttings, magazine covers, corporate banquets, awards etched in glass. But among them was the one picture that stopped me cold every time I saw it. Emily at 12, standing beside me at our first big launch, her smile brighter than the spotlights, her eyes full of pride. I remembered how she had clung to my hand that night, whispering that she wanted to build something great too. Somewhere between that little girl and the woman who signed legal papers against me, something had broken. I opened the drawer of my desk, pulling out folders thick with receipts, tuition payments, mortgage documents, the ledger of my sacrifices. I had worked double shifts in the early days, fixing circuits in my garage until my hands bled, just to afford her Stanford tuition. Ellen had begged me to slow down, to spend more evenings at home, but I thought every late night at the office was an investment in our future. The irony was sharp now. Those same sacrifices had become ammunition, proof that I loved my company more than my family. I traced my finger over one receipt in particular, $48,000 for her final year of tuition. I could still remember walking into the bank, begging for an extension on the business loan just to cover it. She never knew that part. She only saw the distance, the missed recitals, the empty chair at family dinners. My thoughts drifted back to the small apartment Ellen and I had shared before everything began. The cracked linoleum in the kitchen, the second-hand couch where Emily had taken her first steps. I had promised Ellen then that one day our daughter would never want for anything. And I kept that promise, at least in the way I understood it. Emily had private schools, the best colleges, a home on the waterfront when she married Trevor. But sitting alone in that silence, I realized maybe she never wanted the house, or the car, or the opportunities. Maybe she had only wanted me to look up from my papers and see her. The memories pressed harder. The night Ellen called me from the hospital after her first chemo treatment, asking me to come sit with her, and I told her I couldn't leave the meeting because investors were flying in from New York. She didn't argue, didn't even sound disappointed. She just said she understood. That was worse than anger. Emily was 17 then, standing outside Ellen's room while I stayed away, convinced I was fighting for us. Now I wondered if that was the night she stopped believing my sacrifices were for her at all. I pulled out the letters again, Ellen's handwriting fading with time but her voice alive in every line. "She thinks you don't love her," one note read. "She needs your presence more than the company does." I had folded that letter and hidden it in the safe, unable to face it. Reading it now, with the lawsuit looming, it felt like prophecy. The house creaked with the shifting of old wood as I paced the hall, restless. My mind kept circling the same question. When had pride curdled into resentment? I had raised Emily to be sharp, ambitious, unafraid to take risks. I used to boast she was tougher than any boy in her class, smarter than most of my junior engineers. I had wanted her to carry the company forward, but on my terms, in my time. I thought I was protecting her, but maybe what she saw was control. A father who never believed she could lead without his hand guiding hers. I found myself standing in front of Ellen's old sewing room. The door still closed since the day she died. Dust clung to the brass handle, but I turned it slowly, pushing the door open to the familiar scent of lavender and old fabric. On the desk sat a box labeled Emily. Inside were kindergarten drawings, birthday cards, scraps of poems she wrote in high school. Ellen had kept everything. One card in particular caught me. A crayon drawing of me, standing beside a house, with the words, "Daddy builds everything." She must have been 6. The innocence of it cut deep. Somewhere along the line, that trust had rotted into the conviction that I built everything for myself. The day stretched on with an ache I couldn't shake. I drove downtown, the city buzzing with life as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing in my family. Hanson Systems towered above the streets, the building that bore my name and my sweat. As I stood in the lobby, the marble floor gleaming, employees passed with nods of respect, some stopping to thank me for opportunities, for careers that had lasted decades. Their loyalty was proof that my way had worked, that my values had mattered. Yet none of it seemed enough if the person I built it all for believed otherwise. I rode the elevator up to the top floor, staring at my reflection in the polished steel doors. 62 years old, weathered by work, hair graying at the temples, but still sharp. Emily wanted the world to believe I was losing my edge, unraveling into grief and instability. I saw none of that in the mirror. I saw a man who had given everything he had and was now being asked to defend his own mind. I stood at the window of my office, watching the skyline stretch across the water. Somewhere out there, Emily was tucking Sophie into bed, reading her a story the way Ellen once did for her. I wondered if she ever mentioned me in those stories, if Sophie still thought of me as the grandfather who built things, or if I had already been reduced to a cautionary tale. The past pressed down heavier than the rain ever could. I remembered Emily at 10 years old, building a science fair project in the garage. Wires tangled, frustration written across her face. I had stayed up all night with her, soldering circuits, explaining the flow of current, watching her eyes light up when it finally worked. She had won first place. I had been there to see her beam on that stage. I clung to that memory, proof that once she had believed in me, once she had felt my presence as more than absence. But the ledger of failures was longer. Missed birthdays, missed graduations, dinners interrupted by phone calls, vacations cut short. Each one small at the time, but together they built the wall she now stood behind, armed with lawyers and shareholders. As the sun sank behind the sound, I sat in my leather chair, staring at the empty glass on my desk. The company was my life's work, but the foundation beneath it was cracking. Emily believed I had built a kingdom for myself. The truth was I had built it for her, but in doing so I had lost her. That paradox sat heavy in my chest, a weight I couldn't lift. Yet beneath the ache, a flicker of resolve sparked. Ellen's letters had warned me. Emily's lawsuit had confirmed it. But the story wasn't finished. I hadn't survived 30 years of setbacks and rivals just to surrender to my own blood. I would face this fight not only to protect the company, but to prove that I was still the man I had always claimed to be. Whether Emily saw love in my sacrifice or not, I would not let her rewrite my story as incompetence. The night grew quiet, the city lights blinking outside my window. I folded Ellen's letters carefully, sliding them back into the safe. My hands shook, not with fear, but with something colder, steadier. Emily thought she knew me well enough to destroy me. She didn't realize I still had one strength left: the ability to endure, to outthink, to fight when everyone else thought I was finished. I turned off the lights, leaving the office in darkness, the skyline glowing beyond the glass. My daughter wanted to claim my legacy by burying me alive. She would soon learn that the man who built Hansen Systems did not know how to die quietly. The days that followed felt like a descent into a place I had never imagined I would have to walk through. Betrayal has a way of stripping away the ordinary rhythms of life. Meals no longer tasted the same. The steady routines of morning and evening carried an undercurrent of unease, and every time the phone buzzed, my chest clenched as though another truth might be about to surface. Michael had warned me to expect documentation, but nothing could have prepared me for the weight of what arrived on my desk that Friday morning. An envelope, thick with paper, the court seal pressed into its surface. I slid it open slowly, almost as if delaying the inevitable would somehow change what was inside. My hands felt heavy as I pulled out the stack of filings, line after line outlining the case against me. They were meticulous, pages of board meeting transcripts, with my words highlighted and framed as evidence of instability. Times when I had raised my voice, circled in red ink as emotional outbursts. Financial decisions, ones I had thought of as investments in people, our charity partnership with the foundation in Ellen's name, our costly but necessary employee retention program, were now described as reckless indulgences, driven by sentiment rather than reason. Even my pauses, my hesitations, had been twisted into signs of decline. I sat in my office staring at those words, the city alive beyond the window while I felt hollow inside. Somewhere between the lines of legal jargon and manipulated testimonies, I could hear my daughter's voice shaping the narrative, convincing others that I was unfit to lead. She had built her argument with precision, carefully crafted over months. And she had used everything against me, even Ellen's death. My grief, my distraction in those first months after losing her, had been reframed as proof of deterioration. It was then I realized how far she was willing to go. This wasn't just a fight for control of Hansen Systems. It was personal. She wanted to dismantle me not just as a leader but as a man. The ache in my chest deepened as I wondered how long she had been preparing this. Had she smiled across the dinner table while already gathering evidence? Had she tucked Sophie into bed knowing she had filed papers to strip her grandfather of everything he built? That night I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house like a restless ghost, the floors creaking beneath my steps. I opened the safe again and pulled out Ellen's letters, her warnings echoing in the silence. I found myself speaking to her photograph as though she might still hear me. "You tried to warn me?" I whispered, my throat raw. "And I didn't listen. Now she's turning our sacrifices into weapons." The following morning, Michael called. His voice was low, deliberate, as he explained the discovery process. "She's been meeting with Corbin and Wheeler," he said, naming two of our most influential shareholders. "She promised them higher dividends, rapid modernization, aggressive cost-cutting. They think she can make them rich faster than you can keep them safe." The words settled like a stone in my gut. Emily had been building her coalition in secret, selling a dream of explosive growth to those who had no loyalty to me, only to numbers. Worse still, Michael uncovered testimony from employees, engineers, managers, claiming I had shown signs of confusion in meetings, forgetting small details, repeating myself. Lies or half-truths at best, but dangerous when stacked together. She was orchestrating a portrait of me as a man unraveling, and people were believing it. I sat in the study staring at the photographs of past milestones, searching for the moment I had lost her. Every decision I thought was for her, every late night I had convinced myself was justified, now stood in front of me as evidence of failure. The paradox was unbearable. The more I gave to build her future, the further I had pushed her away. But buried in the ache was something colder, something sharper. She had underestimated me. Emily believed she knew every weakness I carried. She believed she could twist grief into incompetence, passion into volatility. What she had forgotten was that I had spent my life surviving storms worse than this. Rivals had tried to bankrupt me. Competitors had stolen our ideas. Investors had doubted us. And every time, I had fought harder, smarter, with a resolve that came from the same place she had inherited her ambition. That weekend, I began my own kind of excavation. I pulled files from storage, digging through old correspondence, contracts, financial statements. If she thought she had every piece of the story, she was wrong. I would find what she had overlooked, the cracks in her foundation. By Sunday night, I had uncovered early communications where she promised investors impossible returns, documents that suggested she had shifted funds without board approval. At first they looked small, almost insignificant, but I knew enough about business law to understand how damning they could be. The house was silent around me, the only sound the rustle of paper as I laid everything across the desk. For the first time since this began, I felt a flicker of control returning. If she wanted to weaponize the past against me, I would expose the recklessness of her present. Still, even as I pieced together my defense, the weight of betrayal pressed hard. I couldn't shake the image of her as a child, asleep in the back seat after a long day at the lake, her head resting against Ellen's shoulder while I drove us home. That little girl would have never imagined this. Yet here we were, father against daughter, love transfigured into a courtroom war. Late that night, as the city glowed with 1,000 windows of strangers living their lives, I stood at mine, staring out into the darkness. Emily thought she had already won. She thought she could bury me under the weight of her evidence. But she had forgotten who had taught her how to fight, how to calculate, how to strike when others underestimated you. She had forgotten that every ruthless skill she now wielded had once been sharpened by my own hand. The truth of her betrayal was brutal, but it also clarified something in me. She was no longer the little girl waiting by the window. She was an opponent now, one who believed she could erase me. And maybe, in some way, she had to become this person because of the choices I made long ago. But that didn't mean I would let her destroy me. I returned to my desk, spreading out the evidence once more. Each page was a reminder that love had turned into war, that my daughter had become a stranger in her hunger for power. The ache in my chest hardened into resolve. If she wanted a courtroom to define who I was, then I would make sure the truth she buried came to light. As dawn began to break, the first pale streaks of light touching the skyline, I closed my eyes and whispered to the empty house, to Ellen's memory that lingered in every corner. She thinks she's already won. But this story isn't over. Not yet. By Monday morning, the quiet despair that had weighed me down was gone, replaced by a sharper, colder energy that felt almost unfamiliar. Betrayal has a way of burning through the fog of grief, and what remained in me was not weakness, but a kind of ruthless clarity. Emily thought she had constructed an airtight case, but in her arrogance she had left cracks. And I had survived my entire life by seeing cracks where others only saw walls. I began the week by calling Steve Wilson, my oldest friend and co-founder of Hansen Systems. Steve had retired a few years back, satisfied to let me run the company while he disappeared into a quieter life of fishing trips and grandkids. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm, unaware of the storm that had been brewing. By the end of that call, his tone had changed. He knew Emily, had loved her like his own niece, but when I told him what she was attempting, the silence on the line spoke louder than outrage. He didn't need convincing to come to my side. He had seen too many men stripped of their legacies by children who thought inheritance was the same as entitlement. The next step was Michael. He had been cautious at first, telling me to avoid confrontation, to let him handle the legal strategy. But when I laid out the documents I had found, the unauthorized fund transfers, the impossible promises Emily had made to shareholders, his eyes hardened with the precision of a man who saw victory in the distance. We began to sketch our counterattack, piece by piece, each discovery adding weight to the arsenal we were building. She had painted me as a man slipping into incompetence, but I would reveal her as reckless, dishonest, and dangerously naive. The days blurred into a rhythm of strategy sessions and late-night reviews. My home became a war room, stacks of files covering the dining table where family dinners had once unfolded. Michael's team traced every financial irregularity, every email where Emily promised things the company could never afford. Steve tapped into old contacts, quietly gathering testimony from those who had worked under me for decades, men and women who could attest not just to my competence, but to the culture Emily sought to destroy. One evening, as the city lights shimmered across Lake Union, I sat alone in my study, staring at the framed photographs of employees who had been with me since the beginning. Their loyalty had always been my measure of success. Emily wanted to sell that loyalty for quarterly gains, but those faces reminded me why I could not, and would not, surrender. My chest ached with the contradiction. My daughter's ambition had grown from seeds I planted, yet she had twisted those lessons into a weapon against me. By Wednesday, we had gathered enough to move beyond defense. Michael drafted a countersuit: breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to defraud shareholders, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The language was sterile, legal, but underneath it pulsed with something personal. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about showing Emily, and everyone watching, that I was not the man she claimed I was. I kept my composure in public. At the office, I maintained the routines, met with department heads, reviewed quarterly reports. To the employees, I was still the steady hand guiding the ship. But every step through the halls, every nod of respect, felt different. Some of them knew. Whispers had spread. I could see questions in their eyes. Was the founder they trusted unraveling? Or was he about to rise again? On Thursday, Steve arranged a quiet lunch with James Corbin, one of the shareholders Emily had convinced. We met at Morton's downtown, a place where deals had been made in whispers for decades. I arrived early, choosing a table near the window. Corbin walked in with the confidence of a man who thought he held the future in his pocket. He wasted no time, boasting about Emily's vision, her modernization strategies, her plan to unleash the company's true potential. I listened carefully, letting him dig his hole deeper. When he finally paused, I spread across the table the documents Michael had prepared. Forecasts Emily had promised. Numbers so inflated they bordered on fantasy. Projections based on staff cuts that would gut our engineering teams, automation that would erase decades of loyalty, cost reductions that ignored reality. His smile faltered as I walked him through case after case of companies that had followed similar paths, soaring briefly before collapsing under their own recklessness. TechFlow Industries, once a darling of the market, now a hollow shell. I saw the doubt creep into his expression, the confidence drain as he realized he might be betting on a mirage. By the time lunch ended, Corbin was no longer boasting. He was cautious, hedging, saying he needed to reconsider. It wasn't victory, but it was the first crack in Emily's wall of support. That night, I returned home exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a sip of satisfaction. This was the beginning. Emily had underestimated my ability to fight back. She thought she had cornered me with evidence and allies, but she had forgotten that I was not just her father. I was the man who had built Hansen Systems from nothing, who had fought off giants and survived recessions, who had learned to turn every weakness into leverage. Still, even in the glow of progress, the weight of what I was doing pressed heavily. I wasn't just dismantling my daughter's case. I was dismantling her. Each document we uncovered, each promise we exposed, was another blow to her credibility, another piece of her reputation torn apart. Late at night, when the files were closed and the city slept, I found myself staring at Ellen's letters again, wondering what she would say. Would she have told me to fight, or would she have begged me to find another way? The truth was, there was no other way. Emily had drawn the lines herself. She had chosen to make war out of love, and once war begins, hesitation is defeat. By Friday morning, Michael filed the countersuit. The papers were stamped, official, the weight of the state behind them. Emily would learn that the courtroom she believed she controlled was now a battlefield where her own weapons could turn against her. That evening, as I stood by the window overlooking the city, rain streaking down the glass, I felt both triumph and sorrow. My daughter had once been the child who believed I built everything. Now she was the adversary who believed she could take everything. And maybe, in some twisted way, this was the only way she thought she could make me see her. But she would see me too. Not as a broken man, not as a relic clinging to the past, but as the father who still knew how to fight. The man who had taught her everything she thought she could use against me. I whispered to the darkness, to Ellen's memory that lingered in every corner of this house. She wanted a war. Now she has one. The courthouse loomed against a sky the color of steel, rain sliding down its stone walls like cold tears. I had walked into many battles in my life, but never one that cut this deep, never one where the enemy was my own flesh and blood. Every step up those wet stairs carried the weight of 30 years of sacrifice. Every tick of the clock a reminder that Emily had turned those sacrifices into accusations. Inside, the air buzzed with quiet energy, the kind that settles before a storm breaks. Shareholders lined the benches, their polished shoes tapping nervously on the wood floor. Reporters whispered into recorders, hungry for headlines about a family tearing itself apart. At the front, Judge Harrison presided, his silver hair glinting under the harsh lights, his reputation for no-nonsense justice a presence that filled the room. Michael sat beside me, his eyes sharp, his voice low. "Stay calm. Speak clearly. Let them unravel themselves." I nodded, though my pulse thudded in my ears. Across the aisle, Emily entered with her legal team, Laura Blake striding ahead in a tailored navy suit, her smile a blade disguised as courtesy. Emily followed, every step controlled, her face composed, almost serene. She didn't look at me, not once. That cut sharper than any argument. The trial began with Laura's opening statement, her voice smooth and practiced, every phrase calculated to pierce. "This case concerns an aging executive whose judgment has been compromised by grief and stubbornness," she said, gesturing toward me with an elegance that carried venom. Mr. Hansen's emotional instability, his outdated practices, threatened shareholder value and employee security. His daughter, Emily, seeks only to protect the company her father built from his own decline. It was theater, and the courtroom was her stage. Charts flashed on screens, lines of testimony projected, every detail framed to paint me as a relic, a man slipping into irrelevance. Shareholders shifted in their seats, some nodding, others frowning. I kept my face still, but inside my chest a storm raged. Then Emily took the stand. I had prepared myself, but nothing could shield me from the sound of her voice, steady and deliberate as she spoke against me. She told stories of my irrational outbursts, how I had raised my voice during acquisition talks, how I clung to sentimental projects that drained resources. She mentioned the foundation in Ellen's name, reducing my wife's memory to a line item of waste. I watched her hands rest calmly on the wood as she said, "My father makes decisions with his heart, not with his head. The company cannot survive that." Each word landed like a hammer on stone. This wasn't just legal testimony. It was a daughter rewriting the history of her father's love into a ledger of failure. For a moment, the ache nearly overwhelmed me, but then I remembered every late night, every sacrifice, every decision rooted not in weakness but in vision. And I reminded myself, the truth was waiting. Michael rose for cross-examination, his voice steady as a scalpel. "Ms. Hansen, what was the profit margin last quarter?" Emily answered, 12%. He nodded. "And the quarter before that?" She hesitated, then said, 11.7. The numbers spoke for themselves, but Michael pressed further. "So under your father's leadership, profits are rising. And retention rates? 94%. Industry average is 67. Does that sound like incompetence to you?" The shift was subtle but visible. Some shareholders exchanged glances, doubt flickering across their faces. Laura objected, the judge sustained, but the damage had been done. Michael's questions had revealed what Emily's words tried to bury. Stability, consistency, loyalty. The morning session ended with Corbin testifying, his voice heavy with the weight of numbers. "We need leadership that prioritizes shareholder value," he said. "Emily understands modern business realities." I watched his face, remembering our lunch at Morton's, the cracks in his certainty. He still stood by her, but his words lacked the conviction they once carried. During recess, I stepped outside into the rain, letting it wash over my face. I thought of Ellen, of how she had begged me to pay more attention to Emily, to see her not just as an heir but as a daughter. Perhaps if I had listened then, we wouldn't be here now. But regret could not rewrite this present. The fight was already drawn, and there was no stepping back. When court resumed, it was my turn. I walked to the stand, my steps deliberate, every eye in the room fixed on me. Michael began softly. "Mr. Hansen, how long have you managed Hansen Systems?" I answered, 30 years. I founded the company in 1995 with $50,000 borrowed against my home. Today, annual revenue exceeds $200 million. Net profit nearly $30 million. Employee count over 1,000. He handed me medical reports and I read them aloud. Cognitive function normal. Psychological assessment stable. Physical health consistent with age. The words were clinical, but the truth behind them was clear. I was not incompetent. I was not unraveling. Then Michael asked the question that mattered most. "Why do you believe your daughter is pursuing this action?" I looked across the room at Emily, finally catching her eyes. They were Ellen's eyes, familiar and yet hardened into something unrecognizable. "She believes I have prioritized people over profit," I said. "She wants to modernize through automation, cutting jobs, raising short-term returns. I want to protect our employees, our culture, the foundation that has made us strong for 3 decades. This is not just a business disagreement. This is a conflict of values." Laura rose for cross-examination, her tone sharp. "Isn't it true that you resist modernization?" I met her gaze. "I resist reckless change. Technology must serve people, not erase them. That is not sentiment, it is strategy." She pressed harder. "Your daughter claims you are emotionally unstable." My voice did not waver. "My daughter confuses conviction with stubbornness, passion with instability. 30 years of leadership have proven the difference." By the time I stepped down, the room felt different. The certainty that Emily had carried in the morning was no longer absolute. There was doubt now. Questions whispered in the gallery, unease rippling through her allies. But the most powerful blow was yet to come. Michael stood, holding a folder marked with the company's seal. "Your Honor, new evidence has emerged." The courtroom hushed as he projected bank statements onto the screen. Transfers totaling $847,000, moved between accounts without authorization. Funds used to finance Emily's campaign against me. The silence cracked into murmurs. The judge leaning forward, Laura scrambling with objections. But Michael pressed on. "This is not speculation. These are bank records. This constitutes misuse of corporate funds." He paused, then delivered the strike that shattered the room. "Furthermore, we have evidence of witness tampering. Ms. Blake coached Ms. Hansen's testimony. Recordings captured during building security sweeps confirm it." Emily's face drained of color. For the first time, she looked not like the composed strategist but like the child I remembered, caught in a lie too big to contain. The judge's gavel struck, demanding order, but the shift was irreversible. As the hearing adjourned, the air crackled with shock. Emily rose slowly, her hands trembling as she gathered her papers. She didn't look at me. Trevor placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her out, but I caught one last glimpse of her face. The steel was gone, replaced by something rawer, fear, confusion, maybe even regret. I stood still, my briefcase heavy at my side, the courtroom emptying around me. Victory should have felt sweet, but it was laced with sorrow. To defeat her was to destroy her, and as much as she had tried to bury me, she was still my daughter. The ache in my chest was deeper than triumph could soothe. Outside, the rain had stopped, the sky breaking open into streaks of pale light. I walked down the courthouse steps slowly, each one echoing with the truth that this battle was far from over. The war was tilting in my favor, but wars between fathers and daughters never ended with clean victories. As I reached the bottom step, I whispered into the cool air, not to the lawyers or shareholders, not even to Emily, but to Ellen, whose absence haunted every choice. She wanted to break me, but I will not let her break us. The morning of the final decision arrived heavy with silence. The courthouse steps glistened with dew, the air carrying the bite of early spring. I moved slowly, briefcase in hand, as if every step was weighted not with paper but with decades of choices. Late nights, closed doors, broken promises I could never reclaim. Inside, the gallery was already full. Shareholders shifted in their seats. Lawyers whispered behind stacks of folders. Reporters poised with pens, ready to immortalize the fall of a patriarch or the redemption of a legacy. Judge Harrison entered with his usual gravity, commanding silence with nothing more than the scrape of his chair. "Please be seated." The shuffle of bodies faded, and the room tightened with tension. I could feel Michael's presence beside me, steady, prepared, though I sensed even he knew this was more than a case. Across the aisle, Emily sat with Laura Blake, her shoulders drawn, her eyes lowered. The defiance that had burned in her all these weeks seemed dimmed now, replaced with a quiet I couldn't read. The judge's voice carried across the room with the weight of finality. "After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and documentation, this court finds no grounds for declaring Mr. Hansen incompetent to manage his business affairs." The words landed like a gavel against my chest, not shocking but still shattering. Vindication should have felt like triumph, yet all I felt was the dull ache of something lost along the way. He continued, "Furthermore, the evidence of financial irregularities and potential witness tampering raises serious concerns about the plaintiff's conduct. The case is dismissed. Mr. Hansen retains full control of Hansen Systems." Murmurs rippled through the room. Pens scratched furiously, but I heard none of it. I was staring at my daughter. Emily's face crumpled, just slightly, as if a mask she had held too long was finally giving way. She gathered her papers mechanically, Laura whispering beside her, but her eyes never left her hands. I wanted to believe she felt regret. I wanted to believe she hadn't meant to let it spiral this far. But the damage was done, and the silence between us was louder than any judgment. As the room emptied, people approached me with congratulations. Shareholders who had doubted me now declared their renewed loyalty. James Corbin, opportunistic as ever, was the first to clasp my hand. "Mr. Hansen, I want to express my confidence in your continued leadership. Yesterday he had nearly abandoned me. Today he was back in the fold, eager to stand beside victory." I shook his hand, but the hollowness inside remained. Laura Blake left quickly, her career bruised by the exposure of her tactics. But Emily lingered. She stood slowly, her purse clutched tight, her steps uncertain. When she reached me, her voice was fragile, barely audible. "Dad." One word, heavy with everything unsaid. For a moment, I saw not the adversary who tried to strip me of my life, but the girl who used to wait by the window for me to come home. I should have turned away. That would have been easier. But instead I said, "This doesn't have to be the end of our story." Something flickered in her eyes. Fear, hope, maybe both. "Not here," she whispered, and walked out with Trevor at her side. The days that followed were strangely quiet. The phones in my office rang with calls of support. Reporters begged for interviews. The board celebrated stability. Yet none of it mattered as much as the silence from my daughter. I spent nights by the window of my home, staring at Ellen's photograph, wondering what she would say now. Would she tell me I had done the right thing? Or would she remind me that I had won a war only to risk losing the family completely? 10 days later, Emily called. Her voice was softer than I remembered, stripped of the sharp edges. She asked to meet, not in an office or courtroom, but by Lake Union, where Ellen used to take her on summer afternoons. I agreed without hesitation. The day was bright, the water glinting under a hesitant sun. I arrived early, sitting on a weathered bench, clutching notes I hadn't needed to write. At 3:15, she appeared, dressed simply, no armor of suits or legal arguments, just my daughter. She sat carefully beside me, leaving a space between us. For a while we said nothing. The lake carried the sounds of joggers, children laughing, the hum of boats in the distance. Finally she spoke. "I never felt like you were proud of me." The words hit harder than any accusation in court. Every achievement, every success, it always felt invisible. You were too busy, too focused on the company. I needed words, Dad, not just opportunities. I turned to her, my voice low. "I was always proud of you, Emily. I just didn't know how to show it." My throat tightened as I admitted the truth I had hidden even from myself. I confused providing with parenting, success with love. And in doing so, I left you to wonder if you mattered. That was my failure. Her eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. When I filed that lawsuit, it wasn't just about the company. It was about forcing you to see me, forcing you to notice. She looked down at her hands. "But I almost destroyed everything." I shook my head. "You forced honesty. You made us face what was broken. And maybe that was the only way we could begin to fix it." The silence between us shifted, no longer sharp but tentative, fragile. The lake shimmered with light, as though reflecting something possible. I took a breath, then said what I had decided in the lonely hours of night. What if we didn't fight anymore? What if we built something together? Shared leadership. Your innovation, my experience. Not as enemies, as partners. Her breath caught, surprise flashing in her eyes. "You'd trust me with that? After everything?" "Because of everything," I answered. "You were right about modernization. I was right about culture. Together we could create something better than either of us alone. Something your mother would have been proud of." She stood, pacing toward the water, her movements restless. I watched her, saw Ellen's thoughtfulness in her stride, her hesitation. Finally, she turned back, her voice firmer. "Equal authority, transparency, no decisions without both of us." I nodded, agreed, and family time protected. No business during Sophie's bedtime stories. Ellen's foundation continues. That's non-negotiable. For the first time in months, she smiled. A real smile. "Deal." She extended her hand, but I pulled her into an embrace. She stiffened, then melted against me, whispering, "I love you, Dad." My voice broke as I answered, "I love you too, sweetheart. Always have." Weeks later, the agreement was signed. Hansen Systems entered a new chapter with two names at the helm. Emily and I stood together at the boardroom table, flanked by employees who had weathered the storm with us. For the first time, I felt not like a man clinging to the past, but like a father walking into a future he didn't have to carry alone. That evening, Emily hosted dinner at her house. The table was set with candles and good china, Sophie bounding into the room with a drawing clutched in her small hands. She showed me two figures at big desks, labeled Mommy and Grandpa, a 4-year-old's vision of harmony, simple and perfect. Trevor raised his glass after dessert. "To family," he said, his voice unsteady. Emily added, "To partnership." I raised mine last, looking at the faces around me, the echoes of Ellen in the laughter, the warmth. "To second chances." As we drank, I felt something I hadn't in months. Not victory, not vindication, hope. When I left that night, Sophie pressed her drawing into my hands. I carried it home, laying it on my desk beside Ellen's letters. For the first time, the ache in my chest eased. The war was over. The company was safe. And maybe, just maybe, my family could be saved too.